Well, hello and welcome again to Skillwork Forum. As always, my name's Tim. I'm joined with my partner here, Brett, for Skillwork, and we get together on this podcast just talk about trends, issues, everything really surrounding the skilled trades. And in particular, here lately, we've really been focused on this concept of the fourth industrial manufacturing uh, revolution, really, that we're in right now, and the transition that's taking place all across the country and across the world in manufacturing. And we just recently attended a forum where a lot of thought leaders came together and talked about where we are, the state of the fourth IR here in the country. And while we were there, Brett and I were at this forum. We met our guest who's on with us today. So please welcome Mr. Pavan Muzundar here with us, and he's going to share all of his great insights on what's going on with the fourth IR, particularly in his neck of the woods. He's part of, actually the COO of a non-for-profit called Automation Alley. And we got a chance to meet Pavan first at lunch, then we heard his presentation. And really, it's just a great thought leader with respect to 4IR and the challenges that he's seen in the industry. We thought we'd just allow him to share some of his thoughts and maybe pick his brain a little bit. So Pavan, welcome to the Skillwork Forum podcast. Brett and I welcome you to the show.
Thanks so much, Tim and Brett. It's great to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, so are we. So again, we were interested to hear from some of your perspectives at the forum. And for those of you maybe that don't know about this, just the Connected Manufacturing is a forum where thought leaders in the manufacturing space primarily focused on advancing technology and helping to adopt some of these concepts around the fourth IR come together. And we presented there talking about the skilled trades gap, and Pavan was there talking about a project that his company is working on or his organization is working on, and we want him to share that a little bit. But Pavan, why don't you tell us a little bit about this organization, Automation Alley, which you've helped, set up, and you're driving towards some, really some amazing evolutions.
Sure, and thank you for that introduction, Tim. So, Automation Alley is, as you said, a nonprofit. We're in the state of Michigan. We're funded by the state, and our mandate is to be the Industry 4.0 Knowledge Center for the state of Michigan, primarily serving our small and medium-sized manufacturers. And as you mentioned, Industry 4.0 is this step change that has taken place in technology. As a little bit of a history kind of recap, the first industrial revolution was when we were using machines to simulate just raw muscle power, right? So it's like the steam engine, the internal combustion engine, just making stuff happen, moving it at higher force and things like that. The second industrial revolution was sort of using that to scale up manufacturing. So we're talking the assembly line, Ford, being sort of the pioneer in creating mass manufacturing, and then that spreads into the manufacturing industry. So we see mass production as the second industrial revolution. The third one is what I would call automation 1.0. So this notion of computers and robotics helping that manufacturing effort. And the fourth industrial revolution is where these cyber physical systems are sort of coming together. So I like to talk about it as flexible automation or smart automation. And so you're seeing this manifest as advanced manufacturing, and this notion that manufacturing and technology are coming together. And that has deep implications on not only how we look at manufacturing, but also, the history of the learnings we have had. Typically what happens is when you have changes like this, they tend to be disruptive. And so the people that have essentially excelled in earlier revolutions tend to be at a disadvantage because they have so much knowledge. And so what we're basically saying is we have to be able to pivot, use that knowledge as a foundation, but be able to pivot into this new reality, which is technology washing over manufacturing. And Automation Alley's goal is to bring that awareness to our small and medium-sized manufacturers. And by the way, it's not that the disruption isn't affecting the large manufacturers. It is. But because there's this change in the types of equipment to use, software skills, different sets of competencies, access to capital and access resources becomes really important. And as you know, Small businesses tend to not have that in droves, right? They have innovation, they're nimble, but sometimes access to capital is challenging. And so what we're saying is, how do you kind of, as a small business, use your strengths to your advantage and mitigate those risks, which is maybe not have necessarily the huge R&D dollars to put into this. How can you make those changes? And that's really what Automation Alley is all about.
Wow, that's awesome. So it's interesting, Brett and I have talked about this industrial revolution, transition through the years, and when you mention the second industrial revolution, the advent of Henry Ford, and all of that took place in your neck of the woods, right? The assembly line. When people think of Michigan, most people think of the auto industry, and that's where innovation in manufacturing took place. But now this next step forward, because they're so steeped in their history there and all of the small businesses support auto manufacturing. How do you consider Michigan kind of being this hub of manufacturing? How are you doing? How is the state doing with this transition? Are they ahead of the curve, behind the curve? What are the challenges?
Well, it's a little bit of both, to be completely honest, right? So in terms of the state understanding the need, understanding the urgency, we're ahead of the curve. So we've seen a lot of leadership from the state through organizations like the MEDC that directly fund us. But we're honestly, if you look at it, the headwind is not technology, it's culture, right? It's, I am an expert in doing things a certain way. I know how to do this. And unless you show me something that really changes my worldview, I'm going to resist those changes. And so those are the kinds of things. And there are fundamental differences in how Industry 2.0 and 3.0 manifest in terms of how you manage people relative to Industry 4.0. In 2.0 and 3.0, we're very process discipline focused. But in Industry 4.0, you have the ability to take what I would call iterative steps and be more agile. But that's sort of counterintuitive, right? If you have a command and control type of an environment in your organization, it's going to be very difficult for you to make that change and sort of almost give a little bit of that control up, be more trusting, because what you've been trained over 50, 60 years is that mistakes are costly, right? When something happens, if a line goes down, boy, that just kills your working capital. That might even damage equipment. Like all those kinds of things are ingrained into do it this way, follow the process. And by the way, you still got to do that in those environments. But when you're talking about technology, there is this other method, which is, you can start making, you can take experiments, you can start kind of making what I would call, controlled experiments that teach you the next step, the next step, and next step. And that's the whole concept of agile and iterative thinking. And the challenge is, how do you bring those two together? And that's really where I think, if companies struggle, it's in that mindset change. The silver lining, though, is, and I see this in small business, once they're convinced, then you just have to get out of the way, right? It's like, once you're motivated and you understand this is what it is, you don't need any more support, because our small and medium-sized manufacturers are self-starters. They've learned how to do things without support from, too many outside entities. And so once they have that, once the sort of the light bulb goes on, that's when everything changes. And so it's a mixed bag, and that's our role. Our role is to kind of be that evangelist of, it is possible. You don't need to have gobs and gobs of capital. There's a different mindset, and you can kind of figure this out. And that kind of leads into what we did with our Project Diamond, the initiative that you mentioned. But that was really an example of that in practice.
Well, how are you today, Pavan? I hadn't jumped in here yet. I'm just listening. I always enjoy listening to what you have to say. I enjoyed it up at the event. I have two, I have a manufacturing background. When Tim and I started Skillwork, it kind of came out of, I spent 30 years in the manufacturing space, owned a food manufacturing company. So, and as a whole, the food manufacturing tends to trail a little bit behind on technology, as compared to maybe the auto industry or, some of the other things. So I have two questions. You can answer them in any order or however you want to. But first, I'm kind of curious on what is your background? What drew you to the manufacturing space, and then obviously the technology. And then my second question, I'll just go ahead and throw it out there. One of the things that I found really interesting when we were up at Connected Manufacturing, and Tim and I have talked about it, I think we even talked about it maybe on our last podcast, was, there's so much talk about the digital transformation and 4IR, and they even tease out, 5IR. But up there, you got all these people that are really close to this. And the reality is they're saying we're really at about 3.2. We're really not as far as we think we are or as we talk that we are. So take those in any order you want.
So you are 100% right, Brett, in that sometimes we feel, and this is where we get into a little bit of trouble with the traditionals, we feel that some of the efforts that are taking place in what people call Industry 4.0 to us looks like exactly what you said, 3.5, 3.2. Choose a number between 1 and 10. It doesn't really matter, right? And you're 100% right. And the reason for that is because what they're doing is they're just accelerating or optimizing the existing. I like to say, imagine the world when we had the horse and buggy, and then some crackpot comes along and says, hey, there's this thing called an internal combustion engine, and you put this smelly liquid in here, and it makes a wheel turn. And all the opposition and all the resistance to that new technology, because it had just not been iterated to where it is today, right? And by the way, we're seeing the same thing with the EV and ICE to EV transition. And so what I see is happening is in that time frame, people going back and saying, forget the ICE engine. What you should really be doing is put a smartwatch on your horse, and it'll tell you whether your horse is going to be running at the optimum speed. And that's what I see some of these projects look like, is they're taking the traditional line. Where I see the blind spots, and sometimes technology has this very insidious way of fooling you by taking its time in developing. The blind spots are a lot of these traditional companies are completely ignoring things like additive, where additive is just a completely different mindset of developing products. And why, and this, by the way, is what we were talking about the other day. And the additive or 3D printing it seems to have this reputation of, it's going to be world changing in 5 years. Every year it's over the next 5 years. What's happening behind the scenes is that things are changing, but they're changing exponentially, but with very small numbers to begin with. An exponential change can be very deceptive. In the early years, exponential change looks like there's nothing happening, and then all of a sudden it kind of shoots up. So you're starting to see this happening in certain industries, but not in mass space, right? And so you're 100% correct in that we look at some of these projects and we say, that doesn't look like you're getting true Industry 4.0. The true benefit of Industry 4.0 is you can think completely digitally, and the process becomes secondary to the design. And there's a huge implication when that happens on how you run your business, the types of people you have in your organization, the types of workflows that you have in your organization, the type of roles and responsibilities that you have in your organization. So I'll stop there, because you asked me the other question and sort of how I kind of got into this space. So my background is not manufacturing. My background is electronics. And I got my bachelor's degree in electronics. So I was into digital design and things like that. And I got a master's in electrical. And then, I was in the Northeast at the time, found it really hard to find a job. So I said, hey, what's the next thing that's and I said, let's see what this computer science stuff is all about. And I basically made a pivot and went into computer science. And with my electronics background, computer science became like this really nice, what I would say is a complementary field. And then I ended up getting a master's in computer science, did some consulting for large companies in the Fortune 500 space, but then moved to Michigan and worked for a small family-owned business. And in that transition, seeing the difference of culture and access to tools and processes in a large organization, but then seeing the nimbleness of a small organization without necessarily the resources, kind of got me thinking about this, how do you kind of figure out the use these two kind of pieces and kind of bring them together, and it set me on this journey of wanting to understand what makes companies tick. Like, why is one company successful and another company not? And it kind of went down this path. And I said, well, if I understand the finances of a business, I should be able to get a better handle. And I've always been intrigued by finance. So I made another pivot, and I got my chartered financial analyst designation. It was an easy way of getting sort of an MBA in finance without actually going for 2-year school, and it was way less expensive. So it was like one of those things, and it kicked my butt in the moment in terms of the rigor of the studies. But even that didn't really answer the question. I was like, okay, so what financial analysis tells you is, give me two companies, I'll tell you which one is successful, I'll tell you which one is not. It won't tell you why. And so that was another kind of down the road, digging deep into things like, the book Good to Great by Jim Collins, and going down the path of Richard Koch and his the 80-20 rule, and just kind of like looking at this. And I came up with this framework where, what you see in the company's results is execution, but what leads to execution is its strategy. But what leads to great strategy is a great culture. And so that created this concept of culture, strategy, execution. And I created a system called iCube, where we basically embody these principles, and we actually create a facilitated mechanism for companies to use this within their organizations and become excellent. And the connection with Automation Alley was back in 2014. Automation Alley had a program for entrepreneurs where Tom Kelly, who's now our CEO and executive director, was the director of entrepreneurship, and said, hey, let's use iCube for our organizations that come in through our program. And we put 25 companies through that program with great success. Tom became CEO and said, hey, why don't we do the same thing for Automation Alley? And said, let's come on in and let's kind of build this organization together. So I came in as the COO, but really just facilitating iCube for the organization in the role that we call conductor in the iCube process. And then Tom is the promoter in the iCube process. And that's how we kind of, went down this path. And when Tom came over, we pivoted as an organization to become the Industry 4.0 Knowledge Center for the state of Michigan. So that's kind of the backstory of how it all happened, and it's been a blast.
That's great. That's an incredible background. So you just have 1 or 2 degrees more than Brett and I combined, but that's okay. So it's just a really compelling background. What it tells me, Pavan, is that you are a continual learner, and insatiable curiosity. And I think that is crucial in this space that we're in right now, and the time we find ourselves in as a country, and this transition. We call it IR, industrial revolution is, like you say, it is not, a gradual transition. It is a complete change. So I think that's a difference. And you mentioned change management. We talked about that a little bit, about getting people on board. And you talk about your approach where culture has to lead strategy. We talk about that a lot. And I think may have been Jim Collins or one of those early thought leaders that said, culture eats strategy for breakfast every day. And
that Lou Gerstner from IBM.
Oh, is that right? Okay. So I know I've heard it. I've heard a lot of people claim credit for it, but
and 100% that, you can't argue with that.
We'll stop short at claiming credit, but we'll say we believe it. And, We're learning a lot more about, I've done some significant change implementation in big companies. So this idea of change management and getting ahead of the culture in these, especially small to mid-sized companies, to adopt this sort of change. Talk a little bit about that in terms of what you do when you go into a company, and maybe some of our listeners that are in our space that are trying to implement technology. And I think one of the keynotes at this forum we were at talked about technology has come in a little bits and parts, and it's stovepiped throughout an organization, just not integrated. They just
Right.
got little bits and parts, kind of like your analogy of a smartwatch on a horse. And the idea that, before you start implementing just the next cool technology, you really need to step back and think about your culture.
Right. So, if there's one word that kind of like freaks people out, it's culture, because it's like, what the heck is it? What do you mean by culture, right? And everybody sort of comes at it, with sort of different perspective. Well, it's like it's a way of doing things. It's social norms. It's how we do things here. I don't know how to describe it. When I see it, I know that it's good or bad, like all those kinds of things, very difficult. So one of the first things that I was trying to kind of solve in this iCube philosophy that I just outlined for you is, what's a good mechanism, what's a good method to kind of break down what culture is. And over time, over multiple iterations, after talking to a lot of people, gathering and the same thought leaders that you just mentioned, I do believe that a lot of these people have done such good work before me that I was able to kind of build upon their work. It came down to, from my perspective, when you look at an organization, if it defines 4 elements, it gets a step closer to defining a great culture. And those 4 elements are, the first thing is, you got to define for your organization is, what's the purpose of your organization? So, it's like, why do you exist as an organization? And it's not to make money, because I can tell you many organizations actually don't make as much money as, if you take the amount of invested capital they have on their balance sheet and invest it in the stock market, they'll probably make more money. There's something more than just making money, right? And there's intangible benefits. So what's the purpose of your organization? Once you know what the purpose is, which is the why, then you got to understand, well, what's the vision? What's the end state? And Collins has described this as the BHAG, right? The big, hairy, audacious goal. What's the end state of your organization? Where do we want to be? If everything was great, what would it look like? The example I like to give is an organization called Oxfam, and it has a vision statement: a just world without poverty. Very simple statement, and it may not be true. It may never happen. It's aspirational. Humans are very weird creatures, right? We're still struggling to kind of figure out how to do this as a civilization. So that may not happen in the short term, but the ideal end goal is very clear. Microsoft, when Bill Gates was running it, had a desktop on every computer, a computer on every desktop, right? That was his goal. And we have one, every one of us. So you could say their end state was actually realized. Now it's about these guys, right? So if you have your purpose and your vision, now you can define, what values do we need to embody to get us there. And the goal of those values is to be completely aligned with your purpose and your vision. And once you define those values, now the idea is, if everybody embodies those values, what happens is the trust in the organization skyrockets. And trust is what you want to make sure that you amplify in the organization. And trust is now much simpler to understand. And by the way, trust and trusting someone and liking someone is not the same. In fact, there are many people that I like, but I wouldn't trust them to do certain things. I mean, I'm very fond of them, but I would not ask them to do a particular task. And the contrary is also true. You might not like someone, but if they say they're going to do something, they'll do it. And you have to be completely objective and dispirited about this whole notion that I'm not going to take my emotion of liking into this. So trust in the organization, when that amplifies, that's now you have a culture that's 100% aligned. Now you can create a playbook where everybody says, if the playbook is aligned with my value, there's no reason for anybody to argue with the playbook. Now, they might argue with some of the execution. They might say, well, we should be doing this first and then this. But you might say, wait a second, are you okay if we do this first and then that because they're both aligned? Yeah, okay, I'll buy that from you, right? Those are the kind. So arguments are never about values. They might be about tactics. They might be about and tactics type arguments. They're easy to resolve because if my values are the same, then it's much easier to say, well, let's try this because ultimately I know we're still going in the same goal. So that's kind of in a nutshell of how you kind of try to get that cultural alignment first. And typically, as we said before, what happens, and it's not because there's a lack of trust, but because changes can be very costly in the manufacturing environment, a command and control type environment comes off as an untrusting environment because the cost of mistakes can be so high. So one of the changes that needs to happen is that the leadership needs to say, hey guys, it's not we don't trust you, but believe me, if this thing goes down, that's going to be 50 grand to the bottom line in this month, like whatever the metric is. I'm just making the numbers up. And then people understand, oh, okay, well, we'll treat this piece with a little bit of, caution, but this piece, hey, here's a sandbox. You can, you go jump in and do what you want, right? And now you start creating environments where people are like, okay, I kind of get it. There's this room where I'm completely careful about what I'm touching, but in this room, hey, this is a padded cell. I can, bounce off the walls. I won't get hurt. And I think those are some of those things that we need to start kind of embodying in the organization.
So, Brett, a lot of what Pavan just talked about resonated with us because just talking about our company, those are very much kind of our construct here and the way we set this up and the way we run things. As a matter of fact, we just took our team through, we do a lot of book studies together here to try to learn together and grow. And we went through a book called The Speed of Trust. Also one of those classics you talked about, a trusting organization. So,
and then we did 5 dysfunctions. If you're a Pat Lencioni fan, which really at the core of the 5 dysfunctions, it all comes down to trust.
Yes.
Do you trust each other? And so, so for sure. And then, we could all rattle off a lot of books, Simon Sinek, Start With Why. So everything you do, you framed it and you were very eloquent in the way you laid that out there. And, but I think it resonates with us. And I think you're right. I mean, that's, if there was one thing that or another thing that I think I came away from at the Connected Manufacturing was how this challenge to take this technology and get your organization to want to do it. And that's a change game, and it's a culture thing, and all those things. So it's like you said, it's easy for the tech people to go, this is going to be great. I think somebody said it there. The first time you say, hey, we're going to come in and we're going to do all this technology, all the people that you just said it to all just heard, I'm going to lose my job. And you got to realize that how you're going to do this is a process. So.
No doubt. So you talked mentioned a couple things I want to give a few minutes to talk about at the Connected Manufacturing. Your presentation there specifically was this example about Project Diamond that, was a conceptual idea that came to fruition that talked about, additive manufacturing, but adopting agile methodology, which comes from the software world, which you're exposed to. Yeah. I have that background as well. And agile methodologies and construct into a manufacturing of a facility is probably a new way of doing business. So can you kind of talk a little bit about that project and how you use that iterative approach?
Sure. So Project Diamond was really an example of sort of opportunity meets preparation, right? So we've been on this journey of really trying to understand what is at the core of Industry 4.0. And at the core of Industry 4.0 is this notion that we just talked about, which is software is going to be driving manufacturing. And then if you take that one step further, the simplest example of that to demonstrate that most tangibly is additive manufacturing. Because in additive manufacturing, you have this 3D design in CAD and a few software parameters and outspits your product. And so that's a very easy, I should say simple, not necessarily easy, but simple way for someone to understand how digital becomes physical. And so we've been kind of going down this path of saying, how do you really socialize this idea? During the pandemic, if you recall, we were having trouble with getting PPE in the early days. So we're talking in the March to June timeframe when things were just kind of like completely in disarray. Oakland County, which is our home county and actually another one of our very big supporters and sponsors. In fact, Automation Alley actually was spun out as an initiative out of Oakland County, which is where we are, came to us and they said, can you define a program that can accomplish two things? One is produce PPE flexibly, but also have the catalyzing effect of digital transformation. And this came out of the CARES grant. If you remember, the CARES grant was this stimulus package that the government passed for small and for local governments, I should say. And they said, we'll allocate $10 million to this project. And then they said, oh, by the way, just a minor detail, you got to spend it in 4 months. So we're like, oh, well, that changes things.
That sounds like a typical government deal, right? Here's the money, spend it in 4 months, so you don't get any more.
So we're like, okay, well, what are you going to do in 4 months? And we quickly came down to, you know what? There's no small and medium-sized manufacturer that I know, or very few, that are just going to buy a printer on their own because they can't justify it, at least not in this time frame. Right now, they're worried about keeping their business open. They're worried about what they're going to do with their people coming in. They've got so many other problems. They're not going to buy a printer. What if we gave them a printer and we kind of sweetened the deal a little bit? We said, this printer is yours to use. You use it for whatever you want. You have to, however, make it available if we want to print some PPE on it. We don't know what the PPE is quite yet, but it's a 3D printer. We'll figure that out down the road, right? And one more thing, you also get an essential business badge from Oakland County, which means you can keep your doors open. And so we assembled like 250 companies in Oakland County, 50 in Macomb. They became our phase 1 participants. They all got a 3D printer. And we said, we'll give you a little bit of training. We'll show you how to use it. And it was kind of interesting what the response was. We had a little bit of a bell curve type response. We had about 10, 15%. They took the printer and they just went off to the races. They were like, oh yeah, we figured out how to use this printer. Some of them started selling stuff. Some of them started making jigs and fixtures, little things to make their shops more efficient, etc. Then we had sort of this majority in the middle that were like printing a few things, still not kind of figuring out how it fit into their world. And then we had a small participant list that said, hey, where's my PP order? And we said, you're not quite getting the point. That was the excuse to give you the printer. That said, though, we didn't really produce PPE for the pandemic. We did produce it for Ukraine. We actually produced tourniquet clips for Ukraine. And we got a request from the Ukraine Ministry of Defense. They needed some tourniquets to be produced. They couldn't get those done in time. So we actually validated the network. What we learned from phase 1 is this thing that I just mentioned. People learn at different paces. So phase 2, which was kicked off in April, is going to now add another 250 companies to the network. But we're now taking them through a much more deliberate process of not only teaching them how to use additive, but reconceive products from the ground up using additive. So design for additive manufacturing, understanding how to find the opportunities, and then build a business around additive. And that's sort of what we want to do in phase 2, where we're basically saying, this is how you take a software first view and learn how to kind of reconceive the entire product from the ground up and be more focused on the intellectual property that you designed or developed through the design than the process that you use to make the product. And there's a whole piece that we can talk about that. But that in a nutshell is what Project Diamond is. And that's where we're headed in phase 2.
Yeah. So you mentioned in your presentation and in your background, you brought in this mindset of agility and iterative, not only additive manufacturing, which is a physical process, but iterative development, which is more of a process, of how you do things. So
yes,
did some of these companies adapt that and see the value of doing these short iterations to be able to change quickly?
I'll give you an example. This is the best example of that. So we had one company that used their printer to take one of their components that they were selling that was manufactured traditionally and they reverse engineered it to produce it using additive. They then found out that if they made a couple of changes to the CAD design, they could make another version of that product. Then they made a third version of the product, or the fourth and a fifth. They have 15 versions of the product. They're selling every single one of them. They're just slightly different from the other one. And what's cool? They don't have any one of them in inventory. They printed on demand. So they have 15 designs that they're monetizing, and they have just iterated the design. They've made it better, but there's some things about the old design that are still relevant for certain use cases. So they've kept that component. Like, that's what better example can you get of iterative thinking? But you said something, Tim, that I want to point out. You're 100% right. Agile thinking is not just about additive manufacturing. Additive manufacturing kind of gives you a method to do that. But one of the best examples we've seen of iterative and agile design is Tesla. So if you've heard, there's a gentleman by the name of Sandy Munro. He's got a great channel on YouTube. It's called Munro Live. And if you watch some of Sandy Munro's videos, he says, and they've been reverse engineering, knocking down the Tesla vehicles for the past, I think, 10 years now, almost. And they'll break down a vehicle, they'll look at it, they'll critique it, and 6 months later, when they break down the next one, they found that the changes that they recommended were in the next one. That's unheard of in the OE business, in the automotive OE business. And we're not talking additive, we're talking traditional manufacturing, but it's the agile software-driven mindset. And those are the kinds of things that we have to, it's independent of what modality of manufacturing you're using. It's like you said, it's a mindset that transcends any technology. It's how do you kind of approach this as, I'm going to be agile and iterative core. And fascinating viewing when you say these, like, and by the way, these are in the same model year. So you might have a model 2016 Tesla with completely different components inside. Mind-boggling. You never see that.
So, well, I know we're kind of winding down here, because I know we don't want to keep you all day, but we would be a little bit remiss, and then we'll kind of wrap it up. If we, obviously, our space, our world is coming alongside manufacturing companies to address, the skilled talent shortage, and we think it ties in directly with the advancement of automation, because what we're seeing, we're fortunate and blessed that we'll be 5 years old this Sunday as an organization, and in that short period of time, we've just seen this growth in demand for higher level automation to basically be able to, work on the equipment that's happening. But just on a broad scale, and any insight. I mean, you work with a wide variety of companies, at least there in Michigan, and you've been in other parts. But what do you see in this talent challenge or shortage or opportunity?
Yeah, so I'll make two comments. We don't have a whole lot of time, as you just recognized, Brett, but I'll make two comments. I think, from my perspective, and this might be a little bit of a controversial statement, I don't think there's a shortage in skilled work. I think there's a shortage in understanding the value of skilled work from the point of view of the employers. I gave Tim an anecdote that I was listening to someone, and he said, I just can't. I don't have enough CNC operators. I've hired 36 CNC operators, and they all leave. And I said, you don't have a hiring problem. You have a retention problem. You found the 36 CNC. So what's causing them? And I think this is one of those things that I think that there needs to be a reality check in some of our employers, in both the financial side, but also the human side, on how how to maybe engage and retain and things like that. And that could be the subject of a whole podcast we don't have time to get into, but that's sort of one viewpoint that I have. I think that if the economics and if the incentives were right, you wouldn't have this shortage. What you're seeing is manifesting because something there's a misplacement in the marketplace. I'll leave it at that. The second thing I'll say, especially as far as the skilled work, I am very bullish And I'm very excited by what artificial intelligence can do in this space in terms of not only making our skilled labor much more productive, but empowered, also upskilling for the long term. You mentioned him, lifelong learning. Absolutely. If you have insatiable curiosity, something like AI can be a great partner. And what we need to do as an ecosystem of both, government, academia, industry, all of us like working together, and we'll do our role as a nonprofit, is to encourage those types of things where we can provide access to empowerment to our skilled labor. I'll give you a very quick example. One of our companies in Project Diamond, when they first started using their 3D printer, the innovations were coming initially. In the first 3 months, the innovations were being driven by the engineering staff. But from the next 3 months, the innovations started coming in from their skilled labor that were on the factory floor, because they understood what the value was, and they now had the understanding that this is an empowering tool. And they weren't necessarily CAD experts, but believe me, they're very good at 3D visualization. Everybody, if you're a skilled worker, you understand 3D visualization, right? So they were coming with the ideas. They were basically just conceived this. Sometimes some of the guys would sketch it on the whiteboard, and they'd say, hey, if you kind of just move this handle a little bit over here, maybe turned it a little bit, I'd probably get enough force, I'd be able to pull it. Those are the types of innovations, and you could immediately put them in the CAD program, iterate them, test it out, print it out, and get to the design. And so I think that's where we can really help the ingenuity and the creativity and the drive of human beings with some great kind of support from AI. I'm personally not worried about AI. AI has no emotion. AI has no purpose. We bring it purpose. We need to bring it the drive, and I think that's how we need to be looking at it. So I'm hoping that we get there, instead of trying to figure out how they're going to take our jobs and all those
Right.
kind of dystopian things. And I don't find those interesting. And we got to work towards this positive side of the world.
Yeah, I think we share those thoughts, and absolutely, there is a mindset, and I appreciate your perspective as we finalize, our time together here. That from your position, as a leader and a thought leader, it's a cultural mind shift that has to change about valuing the skilled tradesmen. That they're no longer, these guys that have grease under their fingernails that know how to turn a wrench. They're becoming crucial to this IR4, and it's important to recognize that there's a value in that, and pointing people towards that is a great future and opportunity. So I think we could probably have another 45 minutes talking with you. We have so much in common, and we appreciate your time. I would encourage folks, especially in the region there around Michigan and that upper Midwest, look into the Automation Alley and the work they're doing there, and reach out to this team. They are thought leaders. It is a knowledge center, and we appreciate so much, Pavan, your time with us today. Continued great success. I hope our paths cross again, and we do have clients up in your area and customers, so maybe we'll get to see some of your clients firsthand, and some of your project folks that you work with, and see some of the great work you're doing. So any final thoughts, Brett?
No, just,
Always welcome. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, we really appreciate you coming on. Like Tim said, I'm sure there's a lot more we could talk about. Maybe we will. Maybe we'll, we've never had a guest twice. You might be the first one. So but yeah, we appreciate it.
That'd be great.
Yeah, again, thank you so much for joining us. And for those of you listening and watching, appreciate you joining us on the Skillwork Forum. As always, we're grateful, and pray you have an awesome day. God bless and take care.